What would you make of an organisation that spent thousands of pounds teaching its employees that their character is predetermined by the alignment of the stars, and that despite what they might consciously think or how they choose to behave, their actions are ultimately dictated by invisible cosmic forces? Now imagine that your employer claims to be fighting the scourge of racism by introducing this training. Bizarre as it seems, employers across the UK are dangerously close to doing just this. Workers up and down the country suddenly find themselves forced to undergo mandatory unconscious bias training, ostensibly to make them less racist. But at the heart of unconscious bias training is a psychological test with just barely more scientific credibility than astrology. Employers are throwing money at a discredited pseudoscientific method that does nothing to tackle workplace discrimination. Unconscious bias training evolved out of the findings of the implicit association test. When it was first introduced in 1998, the results claimed to show that 90 to 95% of IAT participants were implicitly racially prejudiced. The test creators argued that racial inequality persisted because even people who do not think of themselves as racist are unconsciously prejudiced. The implicit association test calculates your reaction speed when associating concepts, positive or negative words, and attributes, black or white faces. In other words, the race implicit association test measures how fast or slow you are to associate positive or negative words with different racial groups. Do differences in reaction speed amount to unconscious racial prejudice? The unconscious bias training industry earns billions of dollars a year marketing unconscious bias reduction techniques on the basis that it does. But the idea is essentially a subjective value judgment on the part of the implicit association test creators. And it's a judgment that looks highly questionable when we realise that meta-analysis consistently shows no correlation between a person's IAT score and how discriminatory their behaviour is. Reaction speed is strongly correlated with cognitive dexterity, which can be improved by practicing a task, so IAT scores can be manipulated up or down at will. And of course, cognitive dexterity naturally declines with age, meaning that older or cognitively impaired people may be categorised as racist by the implicit association test on the basis of this fact alone. Psychologists and neuroscientists, still puzzling over the complex distinction between conscious and unconscious, reject the implicit association test's claim to be measuring subconscious thought at all. In fact, implicit association test participants can often predict their score in advance, showing conscious awareness of something the test has built its reputation on calling unconscious. The IAT is essentially a racism horoscope. A horoscope assigns you a star sign and predicts that you will have a certain set of characteristics based on nothing more than the position of the stars at the time of your birth. Your conduct and character are irrelevant to whether you are categorized as a Virgo or a Scorpio. The implicit association test predicts your level of racial prejudice, your star sign, based on subjective assumptions about the significance of your reaction speed when taking the test, the position of the stars. Your actual beliefs and behavior in relation to race are irrelevant. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Increasingly, unconscious bias training spells out in no uncertain terms which star signs are morally acceptable by combining the fatally flawed implicit bias paradigm with the controversial ideology of critical race theory. The result is a combination of pseudoscience and highly politicized social justice activism, erroneously described as anti-racism training. Anti-racism training divides participants into the privileged and the oppressed, attributing virtue to the oppressed and undeserved advantage to the privileged, with no regard to the actual experiences of those involved. This simplistic, homogenizing act of categorization is liable to generate resentment no matter who it is applied to. The privileged resent being held responsible for historic racial injustice, and the oppressed resent being portrayed as eternal victims without agency or free will. Unsurprisingly, resentment is a common outcome of unconscious bias training, particularly when employees are told to do it or face a disciplinary. But another danger is that it recreates and entrenches the very racial stereotypes it claims to be dismantling. Ethnic minorities taking an IAT prior to completing a task with white teammates report feeling less valued by their colleagues than those who do not take an IAT in the same scenario. This suggests that the IAT can prime participants to understand their worth in divisive, racialized terms. Similarly, training in white fragility only creates a tiny and temporary increase in expressed empathy from ethnic minorities, while consistently decreasing empathy for white people experiencing poverty or adversity. Despite this, Robin DiAngelo, author of the best-selling book White Fragility, charges $20,000 an hour for such training. Perhaps you believe in astrology and find it important to be aware of the invisible cosmic forces at work in your everyday life. That's your right, but there is no justification for imposing this belief on others as fact, especially when it's been proved to be scientifically worthless. Employees are beginning to object to training that asks participants to affirm belief in discredited pseudoscience and which seeks to resurrect the very worst aspects of racial stereotyping. Racist discrimination is a serious issue and a grave ethical wrong. It should be addressed with the most rigorous methods available. Businesses that are serious about addressing racism on anything more than a symbolic level should think very carefully before wasting money on ill-evidenced training that has been shown to make the problem worse. Employees faced with mandatory unconscious bias training should be free to reply that they don't believe in the implicit bias paradigm for the same reason that they don't believe in astrology.